Welcome to Fully Exposed, a podcast that explores the taboo and unconventional in an attempt to educate your ass. I'm your host, Jessica Beuker. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to our show. Today's topic is polyamory, and I am here with Eva Dusome, who is a lead organizer for Polyamory Toronto. Welcome, Eva.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for having me on.
You're very welcome. I'm sure there are quite a few definitions floating around, but if you could start by telling our audience in your own words, what is polyamory?
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of definitions floating around, but my definition that really resonates with me is having multiple partnerships and ethically in the way that all of those partners are either aware of those other partnerships or they even know those people. So that's the definition of polyamory for me. Great,
thank you. So what is the difference between an open relationship and polyamory, or if there is a difference?
Yeah, there definitely is a difference for me. I like to think of non-monogamy as an umbrella term, and then there are various labels that fall under that umbrella term. And being open can be viewed in a variety of ways. One of them is that you are open to new relationships. So that could be anyone. That could include someone who is single, who's looking for monogamy, but maybe is dating around until they find somebody suitable for that. So, being open to relationships. It could be a pair bonded couple who are open to new relationships as well. That could look like swinging or polyamory or casual fuck buddies or friends with benefits, those types of things. And for most people, the tenet of polyamory is that it somewhat looks like some sort of relationship, or at least it's a relationship that is based on mutual agreements and understandings. So even if both people only want, say, a friends with benefits situation, that would still be considered polyamory if that person feels they themselves are polyamorous. So, yeah.
Right. There's this big, emphasis then on the consent and that mutual understanding.
Yes, definitely. That's what breaks polyamory apart from, say, cheating, right? Because cheating is also still being non-monogamous. It's just not being ethical about it.
Right.
Yeah.
It's my assumption that growing up, most children are only exposed to a very rigid narrative, which teaches us that relationships are meant to be shared between two people. When did you first discover for yourself that narrative might be very one-sided?
Yeah, I definitely grew up with that exact same narrative. And I feel sort of robbed that I didn't have the opportunity to learn more. It wasn't until 2007 that I really understood that there were other options for me beyond what is now coined as the relationship escalator. So that is what most of us understand relationships to be, that you want to pair bond with somebody and you want to escalate that relationship up to as far as marriage, monogamy, owning property together, living together. Like those are all tenets of the relationship escalator. And I ended a relationship that, really took a hard hit for me. And I thought, what do I want? What do I want out of life? And I started a relationship with somebody who was married. And it started by them saying, like, we're in an open marriage. And I was like, what? Tell me more. And that was 2007. And I jumped on the internet right away. And like we were just talking about it in that last question, what's the difference between open and polyamory? And open relationships really seemed more geared on the open sexual element. And polyamory was really more, it appeared to look like the deeper relationship side of things. And that's where I started to go, polyamory is really more along the lines of what I think. So.
Right. So you've been polyamorous for quite some time now, I guess a decade. Up until that point, had you had monogamous relationships?
Yes.
And to follow up with that, did they feel natural to you, or was there kind of always something that was off even before you discovered polyamory?
I would definitely call myself like a diehard romantic. So I gave my all in my relationships. And so before I went into polyamory, I had 4 long-term monogamous relationships. So that would be typical of a lot of people in this world. I was a serial monogamist. I went from one relationship to another, believing that maybe this one was the one. And I wouldn't necessarily say that at the time I felt that there was anything missing, but certainly after reading more material about polyamory, getting involved in polyamorous relationships with polyamorous people, I started to realize that, yeah, there was a whole bunch missing from my monogamous relationships that I was settling. I was compromising a lot of my passions and a lot of my desires because I thought that that's what we did.
It's really interesting. I earlier I actually used that term to a friend, serial monogamist. And I think that is probably one of the big things is just not knowing, not understanding that there are other things outside of this little box.
Yep. That's one of the reasons why I am so open and why I'm out to a lot of people. Like, I mean, I don't bring people into conversations with me that don't want to partake in them, but I'm also not really closed about what it is that I do or how I do it. When people ask me things like, why are you single? Or like, I appear single. I will get into it.
How did you navigate your first polyamorous relationship? Were there challenges?
Oh, there were a lot of challenges in that first relationship, as you know, with anything new. So yeah, I did already sort of start telling that story. I fell in love with somebody who was married. I knew both of them, so I was friends with both of them already previously. And there was some flirtation going on. And then I felt that we were crossing that boundary, right? Where it's like, okay, we're crossing a boundary. This isn't just flirtation anymore. We're actually talking about possibly doing things. And that's when they shared with me that they were in an open relationship, and, you know, that really took a whole new path. Unfortunately, when they went back to talk to their partner about, you know, I've met somebody and I'd like to spend more time with them, and I'd like to be able to communicate that with you. How should we go about this? The other partner was not on board. So they, you know, again, learning curve for everyone, but there is this idea of a don't ask, don't tell relationship. And it appeared that their partner, that's what they wanted. They wanted don't ask, don't tell. So the fact that now our joined partner wanted to be very open and ethical about it was not on board with what they wanted. So that was difficult for my partner because he wanted to be open about it. And, you know, it was very difficult to navigate, and their relationship ended up ending many years later. But still, throughout that process, he and I dated for 9 years. There were moments where his partner wanted monogamy from him, and he agreed to that. And so, of course, then I had to back away. But we were still drawn to each other. You know, all of these growing pains of like, how do you be ethical? How do you still honor very real parts of yourself? And I would say that is really when I deepened into this identity, when I could see how much he really wanted to be with me, but he also still very much craved time with her. And I did say that there's still something that she needs to, that you need to learn from her. So go back to her and finish that story. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was challenging.
Definitely sounds very tricky. Humans are very complex. Yes. And I mean, the more, of course, relationships that you're then having to navigate, it kind of just adds layers on to something that's already very difficult and complex.
Yeah.
What does your current relationship dynamic look like? I'm sure it's not black and white.
Yeah.
But I guess if you were to, I mean, if somebody was to ask, what are kind of the terms that you put it in?
Yeah, I love that question because I really have difficulty quantifying my partnerships now because I talk in terms of a relationship landscape. So in my exploration of polyamory, I also came across another label called relationship anarchy. And a relationship anarchist really doesn't see the value in the social hierarchies that we've created. So we have these social hierarchies that our romantic relationships are more important than our friends, that our family should be more important than our friends. And I never, my whole life, like reviewing all of the ways that I had my partnerships and my friendships, I never had stake in that hierarchy. So now, and I've learned a lot from the asexual community as well about how we can honor these friendships that we have that are really in depth and intimate and passionate, that are absent of sexuality. And sexuality is not a tenet of my partnerships anymore, right? So the people that I have sex with aren't necessarily the people that I have deep intimacy with. They may be, I want them to be, but they don't always. So I have passionate friendships that I would call my life partners. I have people that I care about. Like when I start to think about who are the people that I would call at 3:00 in the morning if I had to go to the hospital. So that's what I think of who's on my relationship landscape or my emotional landscape in that way. So there's probably about 15 people, but that also includes people like my father, my children. I have 2 children. I have 2 life partners that I would say, yeah, they need to know what's going on with me. But I am also open to more diverse relationships. So it's pretty complex, as you said. It's not black and white. I have a lot of people in my life that I care about and a lot of people that care about me, and I'm blessed for that.
I love the idea of looking at it as a landscape rather than a hierarchy. As soon as you said the hierarchy, I understood exactly what you said, because I definitely have people and friends in my life that place value on certain relationships over others, which never really made sense to me. I don't know how you kind of rank those in some sort of order. Of course, you get different things from each relationship, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the things I think that you're getting are more valuable than maybe other things that you're getting out of a different relationship.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And so the partnerships that I do have right now, we really have that room and that flexibility to be able to know that we are grounded in a connection. And so there is this thing called new relationship energy where people just get caught up in the energy of people. That happens, right? But this is what normally happens in, say, the traditional relationship escalator, is that everybody isolates then. So they get completely consumed by one person. And I have flexibility in my relationships now where one of my partners are feeling that relationship energy, that new relationship energy. I know that it's going to wax off, and I'm still going to be here when they come back. So there's an element of faith. And they allow me the same, right? When I'm gushing over somebody new, like, I've just met this perfect person, which doesn't exist, right? But
Yeah.
that oxytocin in our brain says, oh, go have fun with this. And so it's really nice to have that element of safety in people and also have the freedom to have that desire and that passion in your life with someone new.
Speaking of safety,
Yes.
in terms of safe sex, how do you and your partners communicate and protect one another that way?
Yeah, I like to talk on the idea that it is a risk assessment. So I start asking my partners questions like, what activities do you think are risky? And maybe I won't see them as risky. So I'm going to, pick some things out of the air. Unprotected anal sex is very risky in my view. I have a partner who will not give oral sex to a penis without it having a condom on it. And I don't have that particular risk. So that's what I mean about people have different risk aversions and what they're willing to take on. So it's comparing those levels of risk, agreeing on, what will happen between us. And I never make rules with my partners about what they can and cannot do. What I say is, these are the things that I think are risky, such as, say, unprotected anal sex. If you have unprotected anal sex with someone else, can you please let me know before we have sex again? That gives me the element of consent that allows me to choose whether or not I want to engage with them again, but still gives them the freedom to do what they want, right? There are consequences to our actions, but we're adults, and I want to be able to make those choices in the moment. That's what I'm here for, is to experience some of those passionate things, So I don't want to limit my partners, but, those conversations about, well, I don't really want to engage with you in that way. So those are the types of conversations I have. They're not always easy. They are definitely not always easy. But I got this really amazing line out of a book called We Bought a Zoo. And the line is 20 seconds of insane courage. Just have 20 seconds of insane courage, and I promise you something great will happen. And so that's how I've been living, I would say, for about the past 6 years since I've heard that quote. So now when I know that when I feel like I need to say the thing, I just say the thing. Like, let's just get this out there.
I love that. I've never read the book, but I've seen the movie,
Yes.
and that was also a quote that really resonated with me. Very powerful, for sure.
Yes.
We live in a world that's pretty set up for monogamy. Obviously, we have things, marriage and common law marriage, everything down to the boxes that we check on government forms and that kind of stuff. So a lot of the stuff that we navigate in our daily lives is very technical, and there's a lot of legal matters. Have your relationships been tested by this rigid structure?
I wouldn't necessarily say, well, I guess yes. My relationships have been challenged, but I would say more so I have been challenged by that. I have difficulty engaging in relationships with people who are very attached to those types of social privileges. So there is a tenet of polyamory called solo polyamory. And it is a description of people who say they're not looking to logistically entwine. They don't want to necessarily live with partners. They may live with roommates. They may live alone. They may live with family. They may raise children, but they're not necessarily looking to co-parent with any particular people. And that really worked for me as well. There are a lot of overlapping tenets of solo polyamory and relationship anarchy, although polyamorous still tend to uphold that romantic relationship as the hierarchy, right? So I tend to want to really combat a lot of the couple privilege that goes on in our world right now. I don't think that we need to privilege people for getting married. I don't think that people should have lower interest rates because they're seen as married, or tax breaks and things like that. And then also the social privilege that goes on is, somebody has chosen you, so therefore you are a worthy person. So I often outwardly look like I'm solo or single because I don't talk about any one in particular pair bond that I'm attached to. And that is to combat some of that thinking. So when people do ask me who are you in a relationship with, or who's the one that you like the most? I always get those types of questions. I always really challenge those questions with, I'm a worthy person all on my own. It doesn't really matter what my relationship landscape looks like. So polyamory has given me that opportunity to really widen my lens on how we've created this world. And how it works, like how capitalism works with that element of couple privilege and wanting to continue the cog in the machine, the nuclear family and those types of things. It is for a bigger issue.
Definitely, that's amazing. Breaking that down is definitely not an easy feat, for sure.
No, it's not.
Let's talk about kids.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned that you have children.
I do.
So recently I was doing some research on polyamory, and I had read an article about a woman who was in a polyamorous relationship and had mentioned that she had children. And I was a little bit shocked out of my own ignorance, of course, because I think in all the times I've ever thought about polyamory, that's one thing I've never considered, is that people in polyamorous relationships are people who can want and will want children. So I'm very interested to know. I think it definitely adds a complicated layer on top of already complex relationships, as we mentioned earlier. But I'm very curious to know what the process of raising children is like in a polyamorous relationship.
Yeah, this is one area that I'm sort of envious about, not learning about polyamory a lot earlier, because What really attracts me, I'm an Indigenous person, and so tribal living really, it really does resonate with me. And the idea of raising children with many people helping out, and not necessarily, having strict DNA ties to everybody is something that resonates with me as well. I had my children very young. So I had 2 children already. When I learned about polyamory, I wasn't looking to have more children with anyone. So I sort of missed out on that step, but thankfully I've been able to witness other people do this very beautiful thing of having children with multiple partners where either they don't know the true DNA of anyone, so all parents are parenting the child without, say, knowing who the father is. And they can go about that in various ways. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a very heteronormative way, right? Like, I mean, queer people have been having families for decades and decades, right? Generations and generations. So this isn't necessarily something new. Having all the parents involved is a benefit to the children. And that's what all of the research shows, is that the children end up really benefiting from having everyone there. When you start to ask questions of like teenage children, they often gripe that they're never alone, so they can't get away with anything, right? And so if there's ever a downside to it, you can only see that as a parent as a plus side, is that your child is getting into less trouble because there's always somebody keeping an eye on your child. We live in a very busy culture right now. I know myself, I work shift work, so I work 12-hour shifts. And to think that my child is coming home from school and is alone for 3 hours on any given day. Like, I don't work every single day, so that's the flexibility of having shift work as well. But, if I'm working on a Thursday night till 7 o'clock at night, my son is getting home from school at 3. He's alone for 4 hours. If I had multiple partners nesting with me, then there might be someone home with him.
How important do you think it is to be talking to your children about the fact that there are different models of relationships at an early age?
I think it's very important. We already addressed that at the beginning of this podcast, that not having that awareness really does a disservice to human beings, period, right? I want to give my children and all children, everyone, the opportunity for choice. And I think that really grows their autonomy early on to be able to say, you have a choice of the way that you want your life to look like. This is the way the majority of people are doing it, via the relationship escalator and monogamy. But there are other choices, and you get to custom make your relationships whatever way you want. It may not be easy to custom make them. You may not find somebody who will understand that because they've been taught the relationship escalator as well. But really take a hold of what it is that you think you want. So yeah, I really think it's important for people to have choice.
You mentioned that you had your children fairly young, and that it was before you had yourself discovered polyamory. Once you had discovered it for yourself and kind of explored that world a little bit more, did you then go back and bring this new education, I guess, to your children? Like, did you talk to them about it?
Yeah, I did. Of course, with any new development of, I was learning about it myself, so I wasn't sure how exactly to approach it with my children. And I'm really lucky that I think I did it well. I just started to talk about, here are some options, without necessarily saying, hey, this is what your mother's doing, right? So I didn't personalize it, so therefore it didn't scare them. Because I just said, like, my daughter is now 22, so she was a little bit older. My son is only 16, so he was a lot younger. He was only 6 a decade ago, right? So different conversations for both of them on what that looked like. But when we started to get into what relationship dynamics would be important to them and how they would, pick those and choose those, I did make sure that I let them know that they had choice in this. I believe both of them at this point, my daughter has dabbled in non-monogamy, but a lot of her relationships appear to be serial monogamous. And my son has definitely chosen monogamy at 16 years old. I think he still very much believes in a fairy tale romance thing. So we got to let them be people as well. And I understand that there are other messages coming from more than just me, right? And those messages are very loud, and I'm just their mother. So
I'm going to actually jump ahead because that ties in very nicely to a question that I was going to save for later on. But as I mentioned, there are still so many people who have never even heard about the term. And then there are people who've heard about it but know very little. And instead of asking questions, a lot of times a lot of wild assumptions are made. I personally think that this is probably because a lot of our education comes from things like movies, television, the media, our schooling. And in those images, books, movies, television, we're not getting depictions of this community. I can't think of a single film or book or TV show that I've watched that has anything other than that one-on-one kind of fairy tale relationship, unless it's in a way that is very, very, very simplistic. So one of the things that comes to my mind is that reality show. I'm not actually even sure of the full title, but it's something like My 5 Wives. So those types of shows are obviously taking an issue or a topic like polyamory, but kind of just brushing over it with one long, very broad stroke. I'm curious to know, do you feel that depictions like that are more dangerous than not talking about it or representing it at all?
I wouldn't necessarily say that they're dangerous. What I think is harmful is when you take, like any type of media is about drama, right? And so that's the difficulty with these types of shows. There was a show called Married and Dating, and it was all about supposed polyamorous relationships. It was very poorly done, in my opinion. But it was like one of the first mainstream things that was put out there. So we were just happy that, people were talking about it at all. But you're right. The media seems to be bringing more attention to polyamory lately. And I would like to see those depicted well. So we live in a very sex negative culture. So anytime you have people who are going outside of that, they're always going to depict them as very sexually promiscuous. There's a lot of slut shaming, and that is the drama element to polyamory, is that people think that we are sleeping with everyone, and we very well may be, but it is often not depicted very well. So there's recently been a Netflix show called She's Gotta Have It, which was the old Spike Lee movie. And so now they've changed it into a series. And it was actually, again, there are some things in there that aren't done well. Like their queer representation wasn't done as well as some of us would have liked to have seen. But just to hear a character on a Netflix show say, I am polyamorous and pansexual and queer, and I'm not going anywhere, it felt like a coming of time moment. And there's a really great YouTube series called Compersion that I absolutely love. But what a lot of these shows do is show polyamory done wrong, or all the drama that can happen, which can also happen in monogamous relationships. So if you look at any type of romantic comedy movie, they often create that romantic triangle, right? That love triangle. So yeah, I would love to have just a happy polyamorous love story. And I haven't seen that necessarily depicted really well. I think that there was a movie called Savage, and that was one where there were two male characters and a female character that were all in a relationship together. Again, some hot sex scenes that really reinforced that they were in relationships together, and the guys were friends, which made it look like it was cool, that the consent was there. But it was a drama, so they had to add in that element as well. But the storyline in that movie didn't center around the relationship, which I liked. So that was sort of a backdrop. And it added some spice and some character to the actual main story, which was more of an action film of like kidnapping and stuff like that. So there are some depictions. They're not great, but yeah, we've already talked about some problematic things about media, right? And polyamory isn't all on its own when it comes to how the media actually displays what it is that we do.
Now that you mention it, I actually have seen that movie, Savages, and you're right. I liked that it wasn't the center of the movie at all. Of course, still problems, and I remember talking to some people when it first came out, and you still get a lot of the, oh, this girl's so slutty, like she's sleeping with both of them. There's still really that issue of that slut shaming, which is really unfair. But I think, and this can be said about any issue that's depicted in media, not just polyamory, but I think one of the things is that people need to realize that everything that you see, of course, it's for our entertainment, essentially. So it needs to be crafted in a way that's funny or dramatic or interesting. And that, yes, there are very real issues that are depicted, but to kind of maybe take the introduction to those issues, but then do your own research, do your own learning, and find your own education that is well-rounded and coming from legitimate, valid sources.
Yeah, I agree with that.
The idea, going back to this idea, I guess, of love and romance in relationships, that is something that is also, in addition to sex sells, but that idea of a fairy tale romance also sells. And it's especially marketed to young women at an extremely young age, basically from the time we're born, when we're introduced to fairy tales and the like. Not that there's one miracle answer to this, but what are some ways that you think that we can move forward as a society to start teaching young children and even people who are past that age of molding the mind to see that relationships are not just black and white?
For me, that starts with how we do our gender conditioning. So we do very much filter female bodies that we feminize, and male bodies that we masculinize. How men behave and how women behave, and this whole idea of men are from Mars, women are from Venus, that we compare ourselves on all of the differences when we have so many more similarities in how we relate as humans than the differences. And I think we need to stop comparing on the differences. So there's a lot of the gender conditioning is a big one, but that also erases a lot of queer identities. So it is a very heteronormative life culture that we're marinating in. And I wish that we could get away from that so that children didn't feel so funneled into just that one true way. The idea of what is perceived in media and what we're taught is very much a codependent one, right? And I don't believe that monogamy is a wrong choice, but I think that a lot of people are taking it as a default, and that is what I think is wrong. And a lot of what is wrong with toxic monogamy is the thing of ownership and possession, and that we now own parts of our partners, and that we become a unit, and that we lose ourselves. So I think if we had more depictions of that, of people still honoring their autonomy, teaching children about boundaries. I honestly did not have a real great grasp of boundaries until I entered into the polyamorous community. And I realized, wow, because I thought that my boundaries were also issued to me with monogamy, right? These are the boundaries you have to live within, whether you like it or not, because it's a part of the relationship escalator. So I wanted deep, intimate relationships with my friends. And I did have deep, intimate relationships with my friends, almost to the detriment of my marriage, my first marriage, because I didn't always honor him to the top of that hierarchy that I didn't believe in. I think that those types of things depicted to our children that honor individuality, their autonomy, their boundaries, the consent issue, and yeah, the breaking down toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. There's, we have all of those things going around, and I think we'd have healthier relationships if we could just get rid of a lot of that.
You see that right from the get-go as well, even with marriage and things like that, that it's a blending of two souls. It's two people becoming one, rather than two whole people just choosing to coexist and love each other.
Yep.
You've already mentioned quite a few, but I'm going to ask just in case maybe there's some that we've missed. But what are some of the biggest problems with monogamy?
Yeah, so again, just to reiterate that I did talk about the ownership, the idea of the ownership and the possession. Those are probably, I think, the two biggest ones. I think that we tend to look for partners who will give us the safety and the shelter from a lot of our insecurities, as opposed to making us face them with support, right? I like knowing that I may be particularly challenged over a certain insecurity. Maybe, I'm just going to pull one out of the air. Fear of abandonment is a big one for a lot of people. And I think that a lot of monogamous-minded, cultured people would want their partners to protect them from that by declaring those things like, I will never leave you. I will be here forever. You can always trust me. When in reality, we are fallible humans, and those things may not always be true. We are not fortune tellers, so we don't know moving forward. And the majority of relationships end. Like, I hate to be a downer about that, but why do we want to live in that fairy tale zone of thinking that I will be the 1%, we will be the 1% that will be different? So I like to be really upfront with my partners and say, like, the likelihood that we are going to come upon the expiration date of this relationship before either of us dies it's a very, it's a thing that's probably going to occur. So let's talk about how we want to end this relationship with the same integrity we started it with. Those aren't conversations that people in monogamy are talking about. There is such a thing as a prenup, right? But a lot of people sign those prenups thinking, this will never be us. And it is often to protect somebody's wealth. It is not really ever about protecting someone's emotional well-being, right? But those are some of the things that I think are some difficulties about monogamy. And I don't even really like using the word monogamy anymore because, that word has changed. It's evolved over time. And so we did talk a little bit about serial monogamy and how that's one relationship that follows another, that follows another. So you have multiple relationships, but never at the same time. And now I like to talk about in terms of exclusivity, right? So exclusivity is like a naturally understood part of that monogamy. But cheating is also an accepted form in our monogamy these days. Like, if I start talking about polyamory, people are like, why can't you just cheat like everyone else? Like, why do you have to talk about it? So that's also another part, I think, of monogamy, because people would much prefer you do the cheating thing than to actually challenge your partner to be okay with certain things.
Which is so absurd to me when I hear it. It's so funny you bring that up. A person who I was having a bit of a debate with brought that up recently and said, I would rather have somebody like my partner cheat on me than be in a polyamorous relationship. And I didn't understand that now that you've said it, that's actually a common thing, because it was completely absurd to me, because in my own head, I thought, well, you're missing a huge portion, which is the consent. I mean, if somebody cheats on you, there's no agreement there. There's no discussion there. It's behind your back or you're lied to or whatever. But with polyamory, it's that discussion. But I guess I never considered that people are really, truly scared of having that discussion.
Very much so. They would much rather live in sort of a fantasy idea that they're living the white picket fence and their life is good, and the outward appearance. Everybody still wants to maintain that outward appearance to the world, which gets you that social equity. That's what it's all about for a lot of people, is don't make me look dysfunctional in the world. So yeah, people are really challenged by this.
Identity is a very important thing. I think that a lot of people fall back on and lean on. And to speak to that in terms of your own self-identity, how do you find that those different identities intersect with you being in a polyamorous relationship?
Oh, so I have always felt othered growing up, like always, because I've always wanted things that were not the norm. My whole life has been that. So I am queer. I've been raised as a woman, but I wouldn't necessarily call myself a woman. I don't feel like a woman all the time. I feel more gender fluid and non-binary. I don't believe that, men and women are the only two choices when it comes to gender. And these types of things are just so unheard of in our heteronormative culture. So I confuse a lot of people. So to me, polyamory is just like one more thing to throw in the hat. Like, oh, of course. Like when a decade ago when I heard about it, I thought, of course I'm polyamorous because I'm like all these other things as well that challenge the norm. So why not this as well? But it makes sense to me that this is one of the reasons why I never felt as alive and as passionate and whole as I do now. It is still very challenging living this way. I just spent the entire week last week with my son's hockey team in California for a hockey tournament. And there's 17 players and 2 goalies. So 19 families. Out of 19 families, 17 of them are all still together. So they're all still pair bonded with the original partner that they were with. Heterosexual couples, 2.5 kids, white picket fence. We live in Oakville, so it's a very heteronormative community as well. So sitting in, dinners, team dinners and whatnot with this type of culture, when I say something, I realize I am not with my people. I am saying things that are just so outside of their mindset. So yeah, all of those things just come to the forefront. And I give off a very white heteronormative vibe. I know I do. And that's for a lot of reasons, for protection, right? For ease of walking around in this world, because I don't always want to walk around the world in conflict and challenge people. But the second I open my mouth and talk, people are like, oh, she's not one of us either, right? So I am very queer. I am very feminist and anti-capitalist. And, day one at breakfast in California, I got into a debate with a mother who started talking about she forced her son to shave because her son's body is hers. And I had no choice but to say, no, your son's body is his. And what you're telling him is that he doesn't have choice. And he's 15 years old. And what you're actually saying is that his look is embarrassing you. That's the message you just gave your child this morning. And she was like in shock that number one, I think that I challenged her in that way and that I gave her that message and that I didn't support her as another parent. So yeah, all of those identities I carry with me all the time. I think they're like a blaring neon sign, but they're not. I don't think that they are unless I open my mouth and really actively take on that confrontation.
Do you feel that geography matters? You mentioned a little bit about going to California and being with these different families. To me, that's actually very shocking because I know a lot of families that have divorced parents. I can probably maybe count on one hand the amount of friends that I have whose parents are still together, the original pairing, as you mentioned. But just to think about, I come from Saskatchewan, which obviously is a lot of small towns. People are not quite as progressive as they are in downtown Toronto. You're probably, if you come and you move here and you live here, you're going to be exposed to a lot of different types of people and lifestyles. Is that a big player in how we also view relationships?
I think that people are really good at putting their head in the sand. so that when they see something that isn't for them, they are very easy to reject it. Some people that, it really truly does not resonate with them are very easy to walk away from. Some people where it really pokes at them and they get defensive, right? Because it may just actually challenge some of those internal bias that they've been thinking. I think that we are significantly blessed to be in Toronto, because it is such a diverse community. The polyamorous community in Toronto is huge, and it is still so very small. So, yeah, I definitely think geography matters. So we run a meetup group. Polyamory Toronto is on meetup.com, and we get all sorts of people trying to join from all across Ontario because they cannot connect with other polyamorous people. If you go onto a dating website like OkCupid, people will change their geography location to say be in Toronto so that they can connect with people. I've chatted with people on OkCupid who have said that they were in Toronto but were really like in Peterborough. Like, okay, I'm not going to drive 3 hours to see you. Like I think that you're probably a really great human being, but I also have limitations here, and I would like more local relationships than that. So yeah, geography unfortunately does matter. I really like to challenge people on this though, people that are not out, because they tend to say like, I could never be out. There's nobody in my community that is polyamorous like me. And I always challenge with, but perhaps they are also scared to come out. Maybe there are 20 people in your community, which doesn't sound like a lot, but 20 people is still a lot, who are unwilling to come out. Or when they talk about not being able to come out to their family and they're like, my sister is so straight edge. And I always ask again, they think that you are also straight edge. So what if you welcomed each other into your closets? Maybe you'd find that you weren't so straight edge. And I know that being an organizer in a polyamorous community, I have actually come across family members, not my family members, but other people's family members who have said like, my cousin doesn't know. And I'm like, your cousin's a part of the group. Like I say that in my head, but I don't say that to them, because, I still honor people's confidentiality. But, people run into each other as well. And I don't know. I just wish that if we could be a little more, I understand the risk, right? I understand the risk of being out in any kind of othered identity. But I think it has to start somewhere. So I think those of us that can be out should be out. We definitely should be out, and we should be talking about it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. For those who are listening and feel that they've never identified with monogamy or exclusivity or whatever you'd like to call it, what are some resources or tools that you feel that they would be able to use to kind of help them discover that there are other options? So you mentioned the meetups.
Yep.
But are there any others?
There's tons. Like I mentioned, back in 2007, the first time I ever heard the term open relationship, I jumped on the internet. We are so blessed to live in a time where we have the internet to give us information. But there's a lot of information to look through now, right? Because anyone can jump on with a blog or a website and fill the internet with maybe information that may not resonate. So people need to remember that. But we're on one, right? So podcasts, there are tons of podcasts that talk about polyamory regularly. There's been the longest standing polyamorous podcast called Polyamory Weekly, and it's run by Cunning Minx. I think there's a decade, maybe 8 or 9 years worth of podcasts that she has. And you can see her evolution as well through different podcasts. There's a new one called Multiamory, which is hosted by 3 people. So it's nice to hear 3 people's variations and perspectives. The website More Than Two is run by Franklin Vo, and they wrote a book with one of his partners, Eve Rickett. Yes, I always get her name mixed up. Rickert, maybe it's Rickert. And that book is invaluable. So it's a very, very thick book, but I would have to say that it's a book that covers everything in a way that, so a lot of people like to say the ethical slut is the polyamory Bible, but I would not agree with that. I would say that the ethical slut is the Bible for thinking outside of sex negative culture. So it really tells you to like dig deep about what your desires are, but I wouldn't necessarily say that all roads end to polyamory from that book, right? There is a term called being monogamish. So you could be monogamish too. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're polyamorous. So there's a spectrum there. But yeah, More Than Two is definitely one of my go-to resources. And those podcasts that I mentioned as well. There's a lot of really great resources. And Opening Up by Tristan Taormino was the very first book that I ever got my hands on. And it definitely is geared more towards a monogamish couple or a monogamous couple that's opening up for the first time. But there was a chapter in there that dealt with people who identified like me as solo polyamorists. So it is in there. And what I really liked about that book was that it has real stories from people. So I could read real life depictions of what their lives look like. There's tons of research books, but I don't need to read about, the research that people have done about it. I would like to hear how people are actually living it. And then on top of that, Facebook has so many groups on polyamory. Some are great, some are not so great. Some are still filled with a lot of oppressive ideas of what polyamory is. And I think that with any type of community that we have, we're going to have problematic behavior. So it's not necessarily about shaming people, but it is about talking about why what they're asking for could have, be problematic. So yeah, you just have to, some of the groups I'm a part of, because I kind of feel like I need to be on the pulse of what happens in the polyamory communities around the country and around the world. But some of them I have those notifications turned off because they don't always bring good content to my page. So yeah, there's a lot of resources out there. There really are a ton.
Can you talk briefly a little bit about being the organizer for Polyamory Toronto? I'm assuming that you deal with all people from all shapes and sizes and different walks of life who have different questions or are at various stages of their relationship. How important is this role to you, and what are, I guess, some of the things that you bring to it to hopefully help people in finding their path?
Yeah, this goes hand in hand with what I talked about earlier about being out. And, if I had only learned about something like polyamory or non-monogamy more than just a decade ago, where would my life be? What would my life look like? And so for that reason, that's why I'm very loyal to this community. And so I find that people seek us out for a number of reasons. One is that they are curious and they just want to know, what the possibilities are. A monogamous couple who are opening up for the first time, who again have read the books, have read, online resources, but now want to meet face to face with people. People who are having difficulty in their relationships. Their polyamorous relationships, they seek out community members to talk it through because they just can't talk with their monogamous-minded friends or family. And then people who really value community. So, meeting like-minded individuals, that's why people are seeking out our communities. And I give my whole heart to this community, and I run our discussion groups that happen twice a month. And I pick a different topic every single month. I've been doing that for 6 years now, and I couldn't imagine not doing it. Like every now and then, of course, it's tedious, just like any other work that we do, right? So every now and then I will think, oh, do I want to give this up? And every time I'm left saddened at that thought. Every single discussion that I run, I leave there feeling more energetic every single time. I'm truly grateful to be able to partake in watching people's aha moments. So someone in the room, it's not always me, but someone in the room will say something and you will see that aha moment in someone's eyes and you're like, we just changed their life. So this is an amazing thing to do. And I often talk about it being an unlearning process because we have all been conditioned towards ownership and possession and codependence and those types of characteristics and ideals. And so polyamory and non-monogamy is more about an unlearning for me. We have a lot of really fun social events that happen. We do bowling and games nights, and we have a monthly social. But then, I really like the educational guidance kind of part, and that's why I really like doing the discussion groups, because I think it's important where we can create safer space to talk about the things that really matter to us.
Sounds like an amazing community.
Yeah, I love it.
And thank you so much for being here this evening and being my guest. I learned a lot of things. I'm sure our audience has learned a lot of things. Again, it's just bringing it back to that education. As you mentioned, there are many more people who feel the same but just don't have those resources. So it's very important as a learning tool. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
That's our show. Thanks for tuning in this week to Fully Exposed. I hope your ass has been sufficiently educated.
This has been an Evoke Media podcast.